The door didn't open the way he expected it to. Not because it was locked, but because, in that moment, his brain seemed to hesitate, like it needed extra time to process what was standing on the other side. The room was quiet. Too quiet. An aging air conditioner hummed in the corner. Yellow light spilled across a worn carpet. It was the kind of short-term rental room you could find in almost any town in America. Ordinary. Forgettable. Everything was normal, except for the woman inside. She was already there, waiting. She didn't stand up. She didn't move toward him. She simply looked at him, calm, steady, observant. The look of someone who had imagined this moment many times before. And then he saw it. Not all at once. His mind seemed to break the realization into pieces, as if delaying the truth might make it easier to survive. No arms. No legs. For several seconds, he said nothing. He couldn't. His chest tightened. His breathing became shallow. A wave of nausea rose, not from disgust, but from shock. The kind of shock the human body isn't designed to absorb without consequences. This was her first date. Just hours earlier, he had been driving with a familiar mix of emotions. Nervous anticipation, cautious optimism, the quiet hope that maybe, this time, things would be different. Anyone who has ever dated online knows that feeling. The woman he thought he was meeting existed only on a screen. Her profile photos were carefully framed. Her messages were thoughtful, warm, and disarming. She listened. She remembered details. She made him feel understood in a way that had become rare in his life. And the truth is, she never directly lied. She simply never told him everything. Standing in that doorway, his thoughts collided all at once. Every late-night conversation. Every imagined future moment. Every expectation he had carried into that room met a reality he had never prepared himself to face. He felt deceived, and then, almost immediately, ashamed for feeling that way. She watched him closely. She didn't cry. She didn't apologize. She waited, studying his reaction, as if she already knew every possible version of how this moment could unfold. The silence stretched between them. No shouting, no sudden chaos. Just a man frozen in place, struggling to regulate emotions that had surged far beyond his control. In that silence, something dangerous began to take shape. Not a plan, not an intention, but a psychological breaking point. A primal response. Fight or flight. The human mind under stress, searching desperately for an escape from a reality it cannot accept. 24 hours later, the woman in that room would be dead. And the man standing in the doorway, a man with no criminal history, no reputation for violence, no record that suggested danger, would be facing a murder charge. The question that would divide public opinion later wasn't what happened. The facts were clear enough. The question was this: how does a first date turn into a homicide? And the answer doesn't begin with the moment the door opened. It begins long before that. In the messages, the omissions, the expectations, and the fragile psychological space where illusion finally collided with reality. Before anyone ever used the word murder to describe him, he was invisible. Not in the dramatic sense. Not the kind of man people cross the street to avoid or whisper about. Invisible in the way millions of Americans are invisible every day. Present, functional, unremarkable, and quietly alone. He was in his late 30s. Employed. Reliable. The kind of person coworkers would describe as normal without hesitation. He paid his bills on time. He showed up when expected. He had no criminal record, no restraining orders, no history of violence that would later make headlines seem inevitable. If you had asked anyone who knew him casually, neighbors, coworkers, acquaintances, they would have told you the same thing. Nothing about him stood out. And that was precisely the problem. His life followed a predictable rhythm. Workdays blurred together. Evenings were spent at home, scrolling through a phone, watching television with the sound low, eating meals alone without really tasting them. Friends from earlier years had drifted away. Marriages, children, relocations slowly thinning his social circle until it was more habit than connection. Romantic relationships had followed a similar pattern. Nothing dramatic, nothing explosive, just a series of slow dissolves. conversations that stopped, text messages that went unanswered, first dates that never became second ones, rejection delivered politely, often indirectly, sometimes without explanation at all. Over time, disappointment hardened into something quieter but more dangerous: resignation. He wasn't angry at women. He wasn't bitter in the way online forums often describe lonely men. But he carried a growing sense that something fundamental had slipped out of reach. That intimacy, companionship, and being truly known were things meant for other people. People more confident, more charismatic, more desirable. So when he turned to social media and dating apps, it wasn't out of desperation. It was out of exhaustion. Online, the rules were different. Conversations were slower, controlled. You could think before responding. You could edit yourself. You could present the best version of who you were without the pressure of immediate judgment. And that's where he met her. From the beginning, the connection felt different. She didn't rush. She didn't demand. She asked thoughtful questions about his childhood, his fears, his disappointments. She remembered details. She followed up. She created the sense that he wasn't just being tolerated, but genuinely seen. For a man who had grown accustomed to emotional invisibility, that mattered more than he realized. Their conversations stretched late into the night. Messages became longer, more personal. He shared things he rarely said out loud: his loneliness, his fear of ending up alone, his frustration with a life that felt smaller than he had imagined. And she listened. That alone created a bond stronger than physical attraction ever could. What he didn't realize, what many people don't, is how deeply the human brain can attach to an emotional connection formed in isolation. When attention becomes rare, it gains power. When understanding feels scarce, it becomes intoxicating. He began to imagine her presence in his life, not in grand gestures or dramatic fantasies, but in small, everyday ways. Sitting across from him at dinner, texting him good morning, existing beside him in a world that had begun to feel increasingly empty. And with every message exchanged, expectations quietly solidified. This wasn't obsession. This was investment. He never asked her questions that would have forced uncomfortable answers. Not because he was avoiding the truth, but because the version of her he knew felt complete enough. Comfortable. Safe. And when the idea of meeting in person finally came up, it felt like a natural progression, an inevitable next step towards something real. What he carried with him into that meeting wasn't lust or entitlement or malice. It was hope. Hope built slowly, carefully, over weeks of emotional intimacy. Hope reinforced by consistency, by reassurance, by the illusion, unintentional or not, that the person he had come to trust existed exactly as he imagined. Psychologists would later describe him as emotionally vulnerable at the time of the crime. Not weak, not unstable, but isolated, under-resourced, lacking the emotional resilience that comes from strong social support systems. When that door opened, it wasn't just a surprise waiting on the other side. It was the sudden collapse of an emotional structure he had spent weeks constructing, brick by brick, inside his own mind. And when structures collapse, the damage isn't always external. Sometimes it happens entirely inside the brain, in the milliseconds between shock and control, between recognition and regulation, between who someone has always been and what they are about to become. The man who would later be called a killer did not walk into that room intending to harm anyone. But intention, as the law would later remind him, is not the same thing as outcome. And the distance between the two can be far shorter than anyone wants to believe. On his phone, she was carefully constructed, not in the sense of deception as most people imagine it. No fake names, no stolen photos, no obvious lies that could be easily exposed. What she created was something far more subtle and far more powerful, a version of herself shaped by omission. Her profile photos were cropped tightly. Her face was always the center of the frame. Soft lighting, thoughtful angles. Nothing about them felt suspicious. In fact, they felt intimate, almost deliberate in how little they revealed beyond her expressions. There were no full-body shots, no casual background details, no images that invited questions. But online dating had trained him not to interrogate those absences. Plenty of people were private. Plenty of profiles avoided full disclosure. Nothing about it felt unusual enough to challenge. Her messages reinforced that sense of normalcy. She wrote with clarity and restraint. Her sentences were measured, reflective. She spoke openly about emotional struggles, past disappointments, and feeling misunderstood by people in her life. She framed herself as someone who had been hurt, not dangerous, not manipulative, but vulnerable. And vulnerability has gravity. It pulls people closer. It creates trust faster than confidence ever could. She talked about loneliness in ways that mirrored his own, about how difficult it was to feel truly known in a world obsessed with appearances, about how people often failed to look beyond the surface. What she didn't talk about was her body. Not directly, not indirectly, not at all. When he mentioned activities that might have prompted clarification, walking together, traveling, meeting somewhere public, she redirected the conversation with ease. Not evasively, just skillfully. She steered discussions back toward emotions, values, connection. Neither articulated these assumptions out loud, and he followed. Because emotionally, that was where he felt safest. In hindsight, investigators would later point to these moments as missed signals. But at the time, they didn't feel like red flags. They felt like boundaries. And in a culture increasingly aware of privacy and consent, boundaries are rarely challenged. There was another truth, one harder to confront. She had learned, through experience, that disclosure came at a cost. Her condition had not always been met with compassion. She had been stared at, pitted, abandoned, reduced to her body before anyone took the time to know her mind. Over time, she learned that revealing too much too soon ended conversations before they began. Online, she had control. She could choose timing. She could choose context. She could choose when or if the truth would be shared. And in the digital world, control feels like safety. She never promised anything she couldn't deliver. She never explicitly claimed to be physically able-bodied. She allowed assumptions to form because assumptions, once formed, rarely require reinforcement. Psychologists would later describe her behavior as adaptive rather than malicious. A survival strategy shaped by rejection. A method of preserving connection in a world that often denied her one. But intent does not erase impact. As their conversations deepened, the image he held of her solidified. Not because she lied, but because the human brain fills gaps instinctively. When information is missing, the mind supplies what feels most plausible. And what felt plausible to him was normalcy. He imagined her sitting across from him at a table, walking beside him, reaching for his hand. These images weren't fantasies, just quiet, unexamined assumptions layered slowly over time. She, meanwhile, understood something he didn't. She knew that the first meeting would be a moment of reckoning. She had rehearsed it internally, how she might explain, how she might soften the shock, how she might brace herself for rejection. She had likely experienced versions of that moment before, each one leaving its own mark. But something about this connection felt different to her too. He listened. He stayed. He didn't push. He didn't disappear when conversations turned heavy. He responded with empathy rather than discomfort. That mattered. And so the decision to meet was made, not impulsively, but with cautious optimism on both sides. They didn't meet in a crowded cafe. They didn't choose a public place filled with exits and witnesses. They chose privacy, a quiet space where explanations wouldn't be overheard, where reactions wouldn't be judged by strangers, where dignity, she believed, could be preserved. To her, privacy meant control. To him, it meant trust. Neither fully understood how differently they were defining that word. On the day they agreed to meet, both carried expectations into that room. Not matching expectations, but deeply held ones. He expected continuity. She expected confrontation. He believed the connection would survive the transition from screen to reality. She hoped, perhaps unrealistically, that it might. What neither of them anticipated was how violently those expectations would collide. The digital version of her had been built carefully, patiently, over weeks. The physical reality of her arrived all at once. And the human mind, when confronted with a truth it is not prepared to absorb, does not always respond with reason. Sometimes it responds with silence, sometimes with panic, sometimes with a fracture so sudden that the person experiencing it doesn't recognize themselves on the other side. When he stepped into that room, he believed he was meeting a person he already knew. What he encountered instead was the realization that knowing someone online is not the same as knowing them at all. And in that moment, before a single word was spoken, the fragile structure holding both of their expectations together began to crack. What followed was not the result of a single lie or a single decision. It was the consequence of two isolated lives intersecting at exactly the wrong moment, under exactly the wrong conditions, with no margin left for error. By the time they agreed to meet, something important had already happened between them, something neither fully recognized. They were no longer just two strangers exchanging messages. They had become emotionally entangled. Their conversations had settled into a routine. Morning check-ins, long exchanges late at night, the kind of steady, predictable presence that slowly replaces silence. Over time, those messages stopped feeling optional. They became expected, necessary. For him, this connection filled a space he hadn't realized had grown so large. After work, he no longer felt the same heaviness walking into an empty home. There was always a notification waiting, a response, a question, someone who noticed when his tone shifted, when his replies were shorter than usual. That kind of attention can be powerful, especially when it arrives after a long period of emotional absence. He wasn't falling in love in the cinematic sense. There were no dramatic declarations, no impulsive promises. What he felt was quieter and more dangerous: relief, comfort, the sense that he had finally stepped out of emotional isolation and into something mutual. Psychologists often describe this as attachment through consistency. When emotional validation arrives reliably, the brain begins to associate the source with safety. Over time, that association strengthens, even in the absence of physical presence. And for someone with limited social support, that attachment can grow faster and deeper than expected. She too felt the shift. This was not the first time she had connected with someone online, but this interaction lasted longer. He didn't vanish after a few days. He didn't grow distant when conversations became serious. He didn't treat her vulnerability like a burden. Most importantly, he didn't push for explanations she wasn't ready to give. In her experience, patience was rare, and patience felt like acceptance. As days turned into weeks, their messages grew more personal. They talked about fears, aging, loneliness, disappointment, about the quiet shame of feeling left behind while others built families and lives that seemed unattainable. They spoke less about who they wanted to be and more about who they already were. That shift matters, because when people share vulnerability, they often mistake emotional intimacy for complete understanding. The brain fills in missing details not with caution, but with hope. For him, the image of her became increasingly complete, even though it was still incomplete. He pictured her reactions, her expressions, her presence in everyday moments. These weren't fantasies he consciously built. They formed automatically, shaped by cultural norms and unspoken assumptions. And that's the danger of omission. Not because it involves deliberate deception, but because it allows the mind to construct a reality without resistance. He never asked questions that might have disrupted the connection, not because he was afraid of the answers, but because he didn't think to ask them. In his mind, the foundation already felt solid. She, on the other hand, lived with a constant awareness of what he did not know. Every message carried a weight he couldn't see. Every expression of anticipation reminded her that a reckoning was approaching. She told herself that once they met, she would explain, that her personality, her kindness, her emotional openness would soften the shock. She believed, perhaps needed to believe, that connection could overcome surprise. They both underestimated the role of expectation. When the idea of meeting in person finally surfaced, it felt inevitable, like a next chapter rather than a risk. They discussed logistics casually, avoiding unnecessary details. The tone remained calm, optimistic. They chose a private setting. For him, privacy meant intimacy, a chance to talk without distractions, to translate emotional closeness into something tangible. For her, privacy meant protection, from stares, from judgment, from having her body become the focus before her words could be heard. And that silence, much like the earlier omissions, allowed two very different interpretations of the same decision to coexist. In the days leading up to the meeting, his anticipation grew. Not excitement exactly, but a sense of resolution. The feeling that something undefined in his life was finally about to take shape. He imagined continuity, that the person he knew online would simply extend into the physical world. She imagined rupture, not catastrophe, but a moment that would require strength, explanation, endurance, both prepared in their own ways. He rehearsed conversations in his head, thought about what he might say, how he might act, how to make a good first impression. She prepared herself for reactions she had seen before. Shock, silence, withdrawal. She braced for rejection, but hoped for something better. Hope is resilient that way. What neither of them fully understood was how fragile the structure of their bond actually was. It had been built in isolation, sustained by screens, reinforced by routine rather than tested by reality. And bonds formed that way can feel incredibly strong, right up until the moment they're forced to bear weight they were never designed to carry. When they finally stepped into the same physical space, it wasn't just two people meeting for the first time. It was two versions of reality colliding, one shaped by emotional familiarity, the other by unspoken truth. And when those realities met, there was no gradual adjustment, no gentle transition. There was only impact, the kind that leaves no time to recalibrate, and no room to step back once the moment has passed. The meeting didn't begin with a conversation. There was no greeting, no nervous laugh, no casual exchange meant to break the ice. Those rituals, so common, so rehearsed, never had the chance to exist. It began with stillness. He stood just inside the doorway, one hand still on the handle, as if his body hadn't yet received instructions from his mind. The room felt smaller than it had moments earlier. The air heavier, time stretched in an unfamiliar way, compressing seconds into something dense and suffocating. She was positioned carefully, facing him. Her posture was composed, deliberate. This was not an accident of circumstance. It was how she had chosen to be seen, directly, without hiding, without delay. For a brief moment, his brain searched for alternatives, for explanations that didn't require immediate acceptance. Fatigue, injury, an illusion created by lighting and angle. But there was no ambiguity. The truth was unmistakable. He felt it first in his chest, a sudden constriction, like the air had been pulled out of the room. His heart rate spiked. His palms grew damp. The body's alarm system activated before thought could catch up. Shock is often misunderstood. People imagine it as loud, dramatic, explosive. In reality, it is quiet. His thoughts fragmented. Simple sentences dissolved before reaching coherence. He was aware of her eyes on him, aware of his own breathing becoming irregular, aware of the fact that he was being observed in a moment of complete psychological exposure. He tried to speak. Nothing came out. Silence filled the space between them. Not empty silence, but charged silence. The kind that demands something happen, even when no one knows what that something should be. She didn't rush him. She had learned that reactions needed time. That forcing conversation too quickly often made things worse. Instead, she waited, allowing the truth to settle the way it always did, unevenly, painfully. He took a step forward, then stopped. In his mind, two opposing impulses collided. One urged him to leave, to turn around, close the door, retreat to the safety of distance where emotions could be managed and reactions delayed. The other urged him to stay, to be decent, to not become another person who disappeared without explanation. That internal conflict intensified the pressure he already felt. Each second without action deepened the sense that he was failing some unspoken moral test. His face betrayed him. He knew it did. Surprise, confusion, fear. None of it could be concealed quickly enough. And once visible, those reactions took on a life of their own. She noticed. She had always noticed. She had seen versions of this expression before, though rarely held for this long. Usually, the moment of realization triggered an immediate response. Apologies, excuses, withdrawal. This time, the hesitation stretched on. That hesitation mattered. It created a narrow window where expectations still existed, where hope, however fragile, had not yet fully collapsed. She spoke first, not to explain everything, not to justify herself, just enough to acknowledge the moment. Her voice was calm, controlled. There was no defensiveness in it, no plea. She didn't ask for forgiveness. She didn't demand understanding. She stated facts. He heard the words, but they arrived muffled, as though traveling through water. His attention drifted between her voice and the chaos unfolding internally. Guilt surged, sharp and immediate. He hated the idea that his reaction might hurt her, that his shock might be interpreted as rejection. And yet, his body remained locked in distress. This was the part no one prepares for. The moment when compassion and revulsion coexist, when empathy clashes with instinct, when social conditioning demands politeness while the nervous system demands escape. He nodded, reflexively, mechanically, as if agreeing might restore order. But order did not return. Instead, his thoughts turned inward, spiraling rapidly. Questions surfaced without answers. How did this happen? Why wasn't I told? What am I supposed to do now? Each question carried its own emotional charge. Confusion bled into resentment. Resentment into fear. Fear into something harder to name. A sense of being trapped. Not physically, psychologically. He felt watched, judged, not by her, but by an invisible audience of imagined expectations. The pressure to respond correctly, humanely, compassionately, while simultaneously managing an internal crisis, became unbearable. She sensed the shift, the tension in his posture, the way his gaze flickered rather than settled, the subtle withdrawal of presence. These were signals she recognized all too well. The moment of truth had arrived, and with it, the realization that no amount of emotional connection could guarantee control over another person's reaction. What followed was not immediate violence. Not yet. It was a breakdown in communication so profound that language itself became inadequate. Two people occupying the same space, but no longer sharing the same reality. The expectations that had sustained their connection collapsed under the weight of unfiltered truth. And in the fragile silence that followed, before decisions were made, before consequences took shape, something inside him began to unravel. Not all at once, but enough to change what would happen next. What followed was not an argument. There were no raised voices, no accusations hurled across the room, no moment that could later be isolated and labeled as the turning point. Instead, there was something far more dangerous: internal collapse. He sat down without realizing he had moved. The chair creaked beneath him, grounding him briefly in the physical world. For a moment, he focused on that sound, the small, ordinary noise, because it was easier than focusing on the storm inside his head. His thoughts no longer arrived in sequence. They overlapped, interrupted one another. Logic dissolved into fragments. I wasn't told. I should leave. I can't just walk out. What does that say about me? Each thought carried emotional weight, but none offered direction. This is how psychological overload works. When the brain is forced to process conflicting imperatives, empathy versus self-preservation, morality versus instinct, it doesn't choose the best option. It searches for relief. And relief, in moments like this, often comes in destructive forms. He felt exposed, not physically but emotionally. He had entered that room believing he understood the situation, believing he was prepared for whatever the night might bring. That belief shattered instantly, leaving him without a script for how to behave. Humans rely on scripts more than they realize. First dates have rules. Social interactions have expectations. Even rejection has a familiar rhythm. But this situation existed outside those structures. There was no socially agreed-upon response, no guidance for how to feel, what to say, or how to exit without causing harm. That absence of structure intensified his distress. She tried to speak again, not urgently, not insistently, just enough to bridge the widening gap between them. But by then, he was no longer fully listening. His nervous system had taken over. Heart rate elevated, muscles tense, peripheral awareness narrowed. This wasn't a conscious decision. It was a physiological response, fight, flight, or freeze, triggered by emotional threat rather than physical danger. He felt trapped. Again, not because she blocked the door or restricted his movement, but because every available option felt wrong. Leaving would make him cruel. Staying felt unbearable. Explaining his feelings risked saying something unforgivable. So he did nothing. And doing nothing, under pressure, is rarely neutral. Minutes passed. Time lost its shape. The room seemed unreal, as though he were watching himself from a distance. He noticed small details, the pattern in the carpet, a crack in the wall, the hum of the air conditioner, because focusing on anything else felt safer than confronting her presence directly. Inside his mind, the connection they had built began to mutate. What had once felt like intimacy now felt like entrapment. What had been comfort turned into obligation. The emotional bond that once soothed him now pressed in from all sides, demanding a response he couldn't provide. Guilt sharpened his panic. He didn't want to hurt her. That mattered to him. But the fear of hurting her became inseparable from the fear of losing control of himself. And when fear compounds like that, it distorts perception. Psychologists later described his state as acute emotional dysregulation. In plain terms, it meant this. His ability to manage intense emotions had collapsed. He began to interpret neutral actions as threats, not physical threats, but psychological ones. A glance felt like judgment. Silence felt like accusation. The mere fact of her continued presence felt overwhelming. And once the mind reframes a situation as inescapable, desperation follows. He stood abruptly, then sat back down. His movements lacked intention. They were reactions, not choices. He felt his jaw tighten, his hands clench. He was aware, dimly, that his body was preparing for something, even if he didn't know what. She noticed the change. The air between them shifted. The quiet no longer felt tentative. It felt unstable. She sensed that the moment she had feared most, the moment when compassion gave way to something colder, was approaching. She spoke his name, not loudly, not pleading, just enough to anchor him. But by then, his mind was already racing ahead, searching for an escape route that no longer existed. Words, which might have defused the situation earlier, now felt inadequate. Too slow, too fragile. In moments like this, the brain stops asking what is right and starts asking, how do I make this stop? That question is where danger lives. The breakdown did not announce itself. There was no clear line separating the man he had always been from a man he was becoming in that room. There was only pressure, and then more pressure, and then a sudden, irreversible release. What happened next would later be reduced to timelines, evidence, and legal language. But in that moment, it wasn't a crime. It was a failure of emotional regulation, of communication, of two isolated lives colliding without the support or space needed to survive the impact. And once that failure crossed a certain threshold, there would be no way to undo what followed. There was no plan, no rehearsal, no moment where he decided, calmly or deliberately, that someone was going to die. What happened unfolded in seconds, driven not by intent, but by a mind overwhelmed beyond its capacity to regulate itself. The shift was subtle at first, a movement too fast, a reaction too forceful, a boundary crossed before either of them fully understood what was happening. Later, investigators would search for a clear sequence, who did what, and when. They would slow the timeline down, frame by frame, trying to impose order on a moment defined by the absence of it. But inside the room, there was no narrative, only impulse. He felt the surge before he understood it, a sudden need to end the pressure, to stop the moment from continuing in the form it had taken. His thoughts no longer translated into words. They converted directly into action. This is the most difficult part for people to accept. Violence does not always arrive with hatred. It does not always announce itself with rage or cruelty. Sometimes it arrives as a desperate attempt to regain control when control feels utterly lost. The room filled with movement. Abrupt, uncoordinated. His awareness narrowed to fragments. Sound without clarity, motion without context. He later struggled to describe what he had felt in those moments, because what he experienced wasn't emotion in the usual sense. It was overload. She reacted, not with aggression, but with alarm. The shift in his behavior was unmistakable. The fragile equilibrium they had been clinging to collapsed instantly. What followed lasted less time than most people imagine. Not minutes, not prolonged chaos. Seconds. The human body is vulnerable in ways we rarely consider until it's too late. Under stress, under force, under conditions that strip away the margin for error, outcomes become irreversible with terrifying speed. When it was over, the silence returned. But this time it was different. He stood there, breathing hard, his body still braced for a threat that no longer existed. His mind struggled to catch up with what his actions had just produced. There was no sense of victory, no relief, no resolution, only shock, renewed and magnified. He looked at her, waiting for something to change, for movement, for sound, for the moment to reverse itself. It didn't. Reality reasserted itself slowly, like a tide coming back in. Sensation returned first. The heaviness in his limbs, the ache in his chest, the taste of metal in his mouth. Then understanding. Not fully, not immediately, but enough. He hadn't meant for this to happen. That thought surfaced again and again, not as a defense, but as disbelief, as if repeating it might somehow alter the outcome. But intention had already lost relevance. What mattered now was consequence. He backed away, then stopped. His legs felt unsteady. He scanned the room as though looking for instructions, something, anything that could tell him what to do next. There was nothing. The ordinary details of the room, the lamp, the chair, the door, felt grotesquely out of place. They belonged to a normal world, a world he had just exited. He checked for signs of life, then checked again. Each time, the answer was the same. The weight of what he had done began to press down on him, not all at once, but in waves. Denial gave way to panic. Panic to confusion. Confusion to a hollow numbness that made it difficult to think clearly. He hadn't entered the room as a violent man, but he would leave it marked by violence forever. Later, experts would explain what happened in clinical terms. Acute stress response, emotional flooding, loss of executive function, a breakdown of self-regulation under extreme psychological pressure. Those explanations would help some people understand. They would not undo what had been done. When the door finally closed behind him, it didn't mark an escape. It marked a transition, from private crisis to public consequence, from a moment of collapse to a life permanently defined by it. And while the legal system would soon take over, sorting actions into charges, evidence, and timelines, the truth remained painfully simple. A single encounter, built on assumptions and omissions, had ended a life, and created another that would never return to what it had been before. For several minutes after it ended, he didn't move. Not because he didn't know what to do, but because doing anything felt impossible. His body remained locked in the posture of the moment, as if movement itself might confirm a reality he wasn't ready to face. The room was quiet again. Too quiet. The air conditioner still hummed. The lights still flickered faintly above. The world, indifferent and unchanged, continued exactly as it had before, an indifference that felt almost offensive in its normalcy. He tried to slow his breathing. Failed. Tried again. His hand was shaking now. Adrenaline still coursed through his system, even as the threat his body had reacted to no longer existed. This is the aftermath of acute stress. The body remains in emergency mode long after the emergency has passed. His first coherent thought was not about the law. It was about time. How long has it been? How long until someone notices? He looked at his phone. The screen lit up, startling him. Notifications waited, mundane reminders from a life that now felt irretrievably distant. A message from work, an automated alert. The ordinary continued to intrude. He put the phone face down. Panic crept in around the edges of his numbness. His thoughts began racing again, but this time without the raw chaos of earlier. This was a colder panic, a calculating one, the kind that asks questions without offering answers. I didn't plan this. I didn't mean to, but it still happened. He told himself he needed to leave, that staying made no sense, that nothing he did now could change what had already occurred. But leaving felt like abandoning something. Not her, but the last thread of the person he believed himself to be. He checked her again, not because he expected a different result, but because he needed confirmation. Reality, once accepted, demanded repetition. The confirmation came. What followed was disjointed, fragmented. Later, he would struggle to recall the exact order of events. Not because he was hiding anything, but because memory under extreme stress does not record cleanly. It skips. It distorts. It rearranges. He moved through the room without purpose. Saturday. Stood. Picked something up only to put it back down. Each action felt both urgent and meaningless. Eventually, instinct took over. He left. The door closed behind him with a soft, ordinary sound. No dramatic slam. No symbolic finality. Just a latch clicking into place, sealing a moment that could no longer be revisited. Outside, the world felt wrong. Cars passed. Someone laughed in the distance. A television played somewhere nearby. Life continued at a pace that made his internal state feel grotesquely out of sync. He got into his vehicle and sat there, hands on the steering wheel, staring straight ahead. He didn't start the engine right away. His mind oscillated between two competing urges, to flee as far as possible and to stop everything before it went any further. This is the phase investigators often describe as post-offense confusion. People imagine that those who commit violent crimes immediately know what to do next, that they act with clarity or cunning. In reality, many experience a period of paralysis, caught between denial and inevitability. He drove without a destination, turned streets at random, passed places that had once felt familiar and now felt alien. Every red light felt like exposure. Every passing glance from another driver felt like suspicion. Eventually, exhaustion overtook panic. The adrenaline drained. The reality settled in. What he had done could not be reframed, could not be minimized, could not be undone. He pulled over, shut off the engine, rested his forehead against the steering wheel. And for the first time since the door had opened, he cried. Not loudly, not dramatically, just enough to acknowledge what his mind had been trying to avoid. By the time authorities were notified, by someone else, not by him, the narrative had already begun to escape his control. What had been a private psychological collapse was now becoming a public matter. A body discovered, a timeline established, a name attached to a crime. From this point forward, the story would no longer belong to him. It would belong to police reports, courtroom arguments, media speculation, and public judgment. But none of that would ever fully capture the truth of what happened in that room. Because the most critical moment, the one that determined everything, didn't occur during the act itself. It occurred afterward, in the silence. The moment when he realized that no explanation, no context, no understanding of his psychological state would ever be enough to bring her back. And that realization marked the end of the story he had been living, and the beginning of one he could never escape. The investigation began without drama. No high-speed chase, no media frenzy at the scene, just a quiet response to a quiet discovery, an outcome that felt almost cruelly proportional to the silence that had followed the crime. When authorities arrived, they encountered a scene that resisted easy interpretation. There were no signs of forced entry, no evidence of a prolonged struggle. The room looked ordinary, almost undisturbed, as if violence had briefly passed through and then vanished without leaving a clear signature. Investigators are trained to look for narratives, but sometimes the evidence refuses to cooperate. They documented the space methodically. Photographs, measurements, notes taken in clipped, neutral language. The facts were recorded without emotion, because emotion has no evidentiary value. What emerged first was a timeline. Digital records placed him there. Location data, messages, payment history. Nothing about it was hidden. In fact, the trail was unusually clear, almost painfully so. He had not attempted to erase his presence. He had not anticipated the scrutiny that would follow. That alone complicated the public's perception. This did not look like a premeditated crime. But the absence of premeditation does not absolve responsibility. When it located him, he did not resist. There was no dramatic denial, no attempt to redirect blame. He answered questions slowly, cautiously, often pausing to collect his thoughts, as if still trying to understand how he had crossed an invisible line. His initial statement reflected confusion more than strategy. He spoke about shock, about panic, about feeling overwhelmed beyond his capacity to think clearly. He emphasized that he had never intended to hurt anyone, but the situation had spiraled before he could regain control. Investigators listened. They always do, but intent is not the same as outcome. As the case moved forward, the legal framing began to take shape. Prosecutors focused on actions rather than emotions, on cause and effect rather than internal state. Their job was not to understand him. It was to prove that a crime had occurred and that he was responsible. And the evidence supported that conclusion. The defense took a different approach. They did not deny what he had done. Instead, they attempted to contextualize it, to explain the psychological collapse that preceded the act. Expert witnesses were introduced, psychologists who spoke about acute stress response, emotional flooding, and a loss of executive function under extreme psychological pressure. They used clinical language to describe something that felt deeply human. But courtrooms are not therapy sessions. The law recognizes emotional distress. It does not excuse lethal force because of it. Jurors were instructed to consider whether a reasonable person, under similar circumstances, would have acted the same way. It is a standard designed to anchor judgment to collective norms rather than individual suffering. That standard worked against him, because while many could empathize with shock, few could accept that shock alone justified what followed. Public reaction mirrored that divide. Some viewed him as a man who experienced a psychological break under conditions he was unprepared to handle. Others saw a dangerous failure of self-control, proof that emotional fragility, when left unaddressed, can have devastating consequences. The victim's life was examined too, sometimes compassionately, sometimes uncomfortably. Her choices were scrutinized, her omissions debated. The question of disclosure became a focal point in public discourse, even though it held little legal relevance. The law does not prosecute omission in matters of romance. It prosecutes violence. In the end, the verdict reflected that reality. He was found guilty. The sentence was severe, but not the maximum. The court acknowledged mitigating factors without allowing them to overshadow the fundamental truth: a life had been taken. When the gavel came down, there was no sense of resolution, no justice that felt complete, no outcome that restored balance, just a finality that settled heavily over everyone involved. As he was led away, he did not look angry. He did not look defiant. He looked diminished. A man who had entered the justice system carrying confusion and regret, and who would leave it carrying the knowledge that his internal collapse had become a permanent external consequence. For the public, the case would soon become another headline, another debate, another cautionary tale folded into the ever-growing archive of true crime. But for those closest to it, those who had witnessed the evidence, heard the testimony, and absorbed the silence between facts, the case left behind a harder truth. The legal system can determine guilt. It cannot explain how two ordinary people, shaped by isolation and unmet expectations, arrived at a moment neither could survive. And it cannot undo what happened once that moment passed. The verdict ended the trial. It did not end the argument. Within hours, the case began circulating beyond the courtroom, shared through headlines, comment sections, late-night talk shows, and true crime forums where strangers dissect lives they had never lived. The facts were no longer in dispute. The interpretations were. Some people focused on him. They saw a man who had been emotionally isolated, who experienced an extreme psychological shock, and who responded in a way that most people like to believe they never would, but quietly fear they might. To them, the case was a warning about mental health, emotional neglect, and the fragility of self-control under pressure. Others rejected that framing entirely. They saw a grown man who failed to manage his emotions and made a catastrophic choice. Shock, they argued, is not rare. Disappointment is not fatal. Millions of people experience emotional distress without harming anyone. To excuse his actions, even partially, felt dangerous. Then there were those who focused on her. They spoke about disability, invisibility, and the social penalties imposed on bodies that fall outside accepted norms. They pointed out how often disabled people are reduced to a single aspect of themselves before being dismissed entirely. They argued that her decision to withhold disclosure was not deception, but self-preservation. In their view, the tragedy began long before the meeting, rooted in a society that teaches people to fear difference rather than understand it. But even among those voices, disagreement emerged. Some questioned her choice to meet privately. Others debated whether omission, while not illegal, carried ethical weight. These discussions often drifted uncomfortably close to blame, sometimes unintentionally, sometimes not. The discomfort revealed something important. This case refused to fit neatly into familiar categories. There was no monster, no clear villain, no simple lesson. Instead, it exposed fault lines that already existed beneath the surface of modern life. Online dating culture, isolation, assumptions built from curated images, the pressure to perform normalcy, the absence of clear social scripts for confronting uncomfortable truths. People argued not because the facts were unclear, but because the implications were unsettling. If he was entirely irredeemable, then the world felt safer. Evil could be contained, identified, punished. If he was understandable, then the world felt far more unstable. If she was solely a victim of violence, the story aligned with legal reality. If her choices were open to discussion, the moral landscape became murkier. And most people are deeply uncomfortable with moral ambiguity. Media coverage reflected that tension. Some outlets emphasized psychological collapse. Others emphasized accountability. Some centered disability rights. Others framed the case as an online dating horror story gone wrong. Each version highlighted certain truths while leaving others untouched. What almost none of them captured was the full complexity of the collision itself. The way two isolated lives, each shaped by rejection and unmet needs, intersected without the tools required to survive the encounter. In public debates, people often asked a single question: who is the real victim? The legal system had already answered that. But socially, emotionally, culturally, the answer felt incomplete. Because while one life had been taken, another had been permanently destroyed. And neither outcome offered comfort, clarity, or closure. The case lingered in the public consciousness not because it was sensational, but because it was familiar in ways people didn't want to admit. Many recognized themselves in pieces of the story. The loneliness, the assumptions, the desire to be seen without explanation. And that recognition was unsettling. Eventually, public attention moved on. It always does. Another case replaced it. Another debate took its place. But the questions raised by this one never fully disappeared. They remained unresolved, quietly shaping conversations about honesty, vulnerability, and responsibility in a world where connection increasingly begins behind a screen. And perhaps the most uncomfortable truth of all was this: no matter how fiercely people argued about blame, the outcome could not be changed. One person was gone. One person was imprisoned. And everyone else was left to confront the reality that modern connection, when stripped of safeguards and understanding, can carry consequences far beyond what anyone expects. The story did not end with a verdict. It ended with a mirror, held up to a society still struggling to reconcile empathy with accountability and understanding with consequence. When cases like this reach the public, the instinct is to search for a single cause. A lie, a flaw, a moment where everything went wrong. But true crime rarely works that way. What happened in that room was not the result of one decision or one omission. It was the outcome of multiple pressures converging, psychological, social, and cultural, until there was no margin left for error. At the center of it was expectation. Expectation is not inherently dangerous. It's how humans plan, connect, and make sense of the future. But when expectations are built on incomplete information, they become fragile. And fragile structures fail suddenly, not gradually. The man's expectations were not extreme. He did not imagine perfection. He imagined continuity, that the emotional connection he had formed would translate smoothly into physical reality. His brain filled in the missing details automatically, using familiar templates shaped by culture, experience, and assumption. That process happens quietly, without conscious consent. The woman's expectations were different. She anticipated shock. She anticipated discomfort. But she also believed that emotional intimacy could offset that shock. That once someone truly knew her, the physical reality would not erase the bond they had built. This belief did not come from manipulation. It came from necessity. For many people who are repeatedly rejected because of their bodies, withholding disclosure becomes a survival strategy. Not to deceive, but to delay judgment long enough to be seen as human first. Both sets of expectations were understandable. Neither was compatible. Then there is isolation, the silent accelerant in this case. Isolation changes how the brain processes emotion. When people lack strong social support, they have fewer outlets to regulate stress. Emotional load accumulates instead of dispersing. When pressure arrives suddenly, there is no buffer. This is not a character flaw. It is a condition. Psychologists call it emotional under-resourcing. In simple terms, it means the person has no reserve left when something overwhelming happens. Under those conditions, the brain prioritizes relief over reason. This is where emotional flooding becomes critical. Emotional flooding occurs when feelings exceed the brain's capacity to process them in real time. The prefrontal cortex, the part responsible for judgment, restraint, and long-term thinking, loses influence. The nervous system takes control. At that point, behavior is no longer guided by values. It is guided by urgency. That does not excuse what happened, but it explains how someone without a history of violence can commit an act they themselves cannot fully understand afterward. Another factor is the collapse of social scripts. Human behavior relies heavily on shared expectations. How first dates work, how rejection unfolds, how difficult conversations are handled. These scripts provide structure. They limit chaos. This encounter existed outside those scripts. There was no culturally accepted way to respond. No roadmap for how to leave without causing harm, or how to stay without violating one's own boundaries. The absence of structure intensified panic. When structure collapses, people default to instinct. And instinct under stress is blunt. Finally, there is timing. If disclosure had happened earlier, reactions could have been processed privately. If the meeting had occurred in a public space, the presence of others might have moderated behavior. If either person had stronger emotional support systems, the pressure might have diffused. None of those conditions were present. True crime often tempts us to believe that evil announces itself clearly, that danger looks dangerous. This case challenges that belief. Nothing about either person was extraordinary. Nothing about their lives predicted this outcome. The tragedy lies precisely there. It reveals how ordinary psychological mechanisms, assumption, attachment, fear, shame, can align in catastrophic ways when unchecked by communication, context, or support. This was not about cruelty. It was not about hatred. It was about collapse. A collapse of expectations. A collapse of emotional regulation. A collapse of the fragile systems people rely on to remain themselves under stress. And once that collapse occurred, there was no internal safeguard left to prevent irreversible harm. True crime does not always teach us how to spot monsters. Sometimes, it teaches us how dangerously human people can be. When connection forms in isolation, when truth arrives without preparation, and when the mind is pushed beyond its capacity to cope. That is the lesson this case leaves behind. Not comforting, not simple, but essential to understand, because the conditions that produce this tragedy are far more common than most people want to believe.